This is the Mining and Metallurgical Society of America webinar on ESG, Environment, Social, and Governance. This is the beginning of a series of 5 webinars designed for professionals working for mining companies. And we target those who are involved in the preparation of studies and disclosure documents. If you are a QP, we're also planning another webinar in November about 43101 and the new SEC SK 1300 regulations. So once you've signed up for this webinar, you will also get notices about future webinars. So anyway, let's go ahead and get started. This first session is a general introduction to these topics. We have 2 of our presenters here. Unfortunately, the 3rd presenter is not available today, but we will go ahead and get started. Lauren Meyer works for Stantec, and she is going to talk about the social license to operate. And the interesting thing about the ESG and why it's all put together in one topic is that there's a lot of interactions between the environment, social, and government. So go ahead, Lauren, and go ahead and start with your presentation. This is Lauren's initial slide up there that you're seeing. So thanks for participating, Lauren. I appreciate it. Oh yeah, one more thing. If you have questions, send us questions and answers in the option at the bottom of the screen. You can open your Q&A window, and also there's a chat window. We will take questions after each of the speakers talk. So go ahead, Lauren, thanks.
Great, thanks, Betty. So as Betty mentioned, I will be starting things off today discussing the social considerations of ESG, and we'll specifically touch on how addressing social aspects of ESG can help the mining industry maintain a social license to operate. So a quick introduction of myself. As Betty mentioned, my name is Lauren Meyer. I work for Stantec, and I'm a professional geotechnical engineer. I'm currently based in Fort Collins, Colorado, and I obtained my undergraduate and graduate degree in geological engineering from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. My focus area is mining, specifically tailings and waste management. And over the last couple of years, I have gotten involved in helping develop Stantec's Sustainable Mining by Design initiative. In terms of credentials, I have my Envision Sustainability Professional certification, and I'm currently working on a certificate in sustainable infrastructure, and I'm hoping to finish that up this year. On the right-hand side of this slide is our cat Baxter and our dog Porter. Hopefully they don't make a cameo today, but maybe you will be graced with their presence during this presentation. And then on the photo on the left is my husband, Kyle. So today I will touch on the why, the what, and the how of the S in ESG. The agenda for the portion of my portion of today's webinar will focus on why we care about sustainability, particularly the social aspects. And then I'll quickly touch on what we are navigating in terms of frameworks and standards, and move on to a discussion of some tangible, actionable things that can be done to meet social sustainability needs, and end with some examples of how we are already adapting. So I'm going to try to make this section quick because some of you may already have exposure to this, but I wanted to give a little bit of background for those of you who are less familiar with the idea of sustainability and ESG. So why do we care about sustainability, particularly social sustainability, and what are the business benefits for the mining industry? Pulled this graphic from Ernst & Young, and it depicts the top business risks that we're facing in the mining and metals industry. And you'll notice here that license to operate is the #1, and it has actually been for the last couple of years. There are a couple of different aspects of license to operate, but I would argue that the social license to operate is the most critical here. As we go on, you'll really start to notice how ESG is all quite intertwined, as Betty mentioned. However, without the support of the communities that we work in terms of social license, we will likely face conflict and opposition. All right, so a couple of quick facts. ESG is now really a fundamental part of the investment and supply chain decisions that are being made. BlackRock, which is the world's largest fund manager, is planning to divest from any company earning more than 25% of its revenue from thermal coal. And in 2021, they decided to expand their review to more than 1,000 companies that represent 90% of the global scope 1 and 2 emissions. And this is up from 440 companies that were reviewed in 2020. Additionally, in 2020, Norway's Norges Bank dropped several companies from the US 1 trillion sovereign wealth fund, and it placed some others under observation for production of coal and coal-based energy, and has blacklisted others for causing severe environmental damage. So the investors that we have really are paying attention to what it is that we're doing and the impacts that we're having on the environment and our communities. The more social side of this, specific to inclusion and diversity, BlackRock also started requiring that US companies disclose more workforce diversity information, including demographics such as age, gender, ethnicity, with the intent of acting against some companies who are not making inclusion and diversity a key goal. Additionally, State Street Global Advisors has integrated diversity metrics into their ESG scoring system. Goldman Sachs has said that it would no longer take a company public in the US or Europe if they did not meet enhanced diversity and gender criteria. And NASDAQ has said that most US companies would have to include at least one director who identified as female and one who identified as an underrepresented minority or LGBTQ. So it should be pretty obvious based on what I've shared that our stakeholders are going to start expecting better performance, and also expect that ESG become more intertwined in mining. We really can no longer pick and choose anymore what it is we want to address, and we need to be addressing all forms of capital. So I've laid out here the 4 forms of capital. We have financial, manufactured, human, and natural. Human capital would be more the social side of ESG, and natural capital would be the more environmental side of ESG. And in general, as an industry, we have had a strong environmental due diligence up to this point, but less so a human rights due diligence. And I'll note here that environmental rights really are human rights. They're intertwined. However, human capital really also requires addressing community and cultural impacts, as well as equity, equality, health, well-being, safety, etc. Now that we've talked a little bit about why we should care about sustainability, let's move on and talk about what it is we're navigating here in terms of frameworks and standards. All right, so I really love this slide because it depicts how overwhelming these sustainability frameworks, initiatives, and authorities can be. These were pulled from industry sustainability reports, and the words on this slide are larger for the words that show up the most in these reports. And you can see right there in the middle, UN Sustainable Development Goals in orange. Most of the standards can easily be cascaded with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and everything really ends up referencing back to this core set of goals that were developed by the UN. The good news in terms of frameworks is that a lot of these groups are finally starting to work together on a range of projects to advance a more unified approach and some cross-recognition of these standards, which will be beneficial for us in terms of finally navigating these frameworks and addressing the sustainability goals with cross-reference between them. Now let's focus a little bit more on the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So my initial plan when I was pulling this slide together was to highlight the goals here that apply mostly to the social aspects of sustainability. And when I started this exercise, I ended up highlighting almost every single one of the goals on this slide, which I found really interesting, though it did not surprise me. But it really just goes to show just how intertwined the environmental, social, and governance aspects of sustainability are. There are a number of goals on this slide that are obviously, or more obviously address the social aspects, like no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, and gender equality. And then there are others like climate action or clean water and sanitation that may not on the surface be clearly a social issue, but do directly affect the communities that we work in and are things that our stakeholders value and find important. And this ties back to what I was just saying about environmental rights and human rights really being intertwined. Next, I would like to answer the question of the how. How do we follow through on the sustainability pledges that our companies are making, particularly for the goals of improving social sustainability? Now, the big question, right? How do we do this? How do we improve our practices in terms of social sustainability? So I've broken this out into a couple of different areas over 2 slides, so bear with me. But the first 2 that I'm going to touch on here are community engagement and communication. The first one here is really important: engage your community. I can't stress that enough. It's probably the pinnacle of the social aspect of ESG. The first step of this would be conducting a stakeholder mapping exercise and setting some clear objectives of the stakeholder meetings that you'll be holding, and engaging stakeholders throughout the mine life cycle. So this is not something that we just do at the beginning of a project. We should be checking in with our stakeholders throughout the project, whether or not that be during design, construction, operations, or closure. And I'll add to this here, the feeling of inclusion is quite powerful. So wherever possible, we should be trying to involve the community directly in the work that we're conducting. Maybe instead of holding large catch-all community meetings, host multiple smaller gatherings to prioritize building more individual relationships with your stakeholders. This also allows you to gain a much better understanding of the various concerns and priorities that they have. And in general, these smaller meetings also tend to make people feel more comfortable. And so they would be more open to expressing their opinions and sharing their true concerns. And then use these meetings to determine how the project objectives align with the needs of the goals of the local community. Is there something that you can give back to the community that they need? Is there something that you can share with them? And empower your communities to engage in the development process and ensure that the impacts and benefits are distributed equitably throughout the affected communities. And then secondly, on this slide, we have we really need to improve our communication and be more transparent with our stakeholders. So this can be done by developing 2-way communication and providing sufficient opportunities for stakeholders to get involved, and also by developing communication between project leads and stakeholder groups to allow for incorporation of stakeholder feedback in the project process. And then with that, we can create feedback loops to gauge stakeholder satisfaction, or establish grievance mechanisms for the stakeholders if they're unsatisfied with the project outcomes. And I'll add to this, when you need to describe a complex idea or process, words really can only get you so far. 90% of the information that is transmitted to our brains is visual, but visual information doesn't have to necessarily be pictures. So this is where you can get really creative. And if you need to, really consider bringing in an expert to help you describe complex ideas. And then lastly, consider providing information to the community when they ask for it. For instance, if they're concerned about water quality and want to see the data, and you can provide it to them, do it. Transparency is definitely key here. This is how we would start building or rebuilding the trust in the communities that we work in. The last 2 areas that I have here are developing local skills and considering culture and health. And the first step of developing local skills is stimulating economic prosperity and development by creating local jobs during design, construction, and operation, and then developing local skills and capabilities through an inclusive culture of training programs. So maybe you need to include training that's in different languages, maybe multiple languages, depending on the community that you're working in. And when you do this, not only will you be adding value to the community by providing them education and jobs, but in doing so, you will also be building trust and local support that is needed from the community in order to maintain that social license to operate. And then secondly, we need to be using the input that we get from the community during these stakeholder meetings to identify areas that they consider historic and cultural resources. And we need to be avoiding development in these areas and take steps to preserve or restore these cultural resources when they're identified. And I'm sure that Patrick will touch on this a little bit, but it's important to assess project impacts and reduce air and water pollution to improve the health of the communities that we're working in. This would include consideration of incorporating critical infrastructure, particularly for areas where we would expect there to be potential health effects or personal safety impacts to the people in that community that are directly related to the projects that we're working on. All right, so how are we adapting? Let's discuss a couple of examples, and then I'll touch on governance before I go to questions today, because Betty has asked me to give a little bit of background on that as well. So several mining companies have actually started to address the social principles I just outlined and have incorporated them into their project plans. So I'm going to share two examples of how making some design changes can result in multiple benefits for both the mine and the community that you're working in. So Stantec worked on a project in South America where the client was looking to expand their mine operations. And the project site was located in an arid climate. As you can imagine, arid climate, probably lack of water, right? So the operators very quickly realized that they would need more water in order to meet the demands that the expansion would require. So while our team was looking for a solution to this problem, the mine decided to reach out to the local community. And in doing so, they found out that the community lacked infrastructure to properly treat their wastewater. Oh, sorry. So at the time, the wastewater of the community was being discharged into a nearby river and was going totally untreated. So as a team, we decided to try developing a single solution to meet both challenges. And in doing so, we decided that that solution was designing a wastewater treatment plant. So the wastewater treatment plant provided the water that was needed for the project. And it also enhanced the social license to operate in the area by giving back to the local community. So we developed this wastewater treatment plant that directly benefited the community by providing them clean water, and also resulted in the community having a significant reduction in health risks. And as an added bonus, aside from the health risks, the community's agricultural products are actually now accepted in international markets where they had previously been rejected due to health risks. And the aquatic ecosystems in the areas have also recovered, which has increased tourism in the area. So as you can see, this one design, which had one main benefit for the mine itself, has really had a series of benefits for the community that we were working in. The second example I have for today comes from a remote Indonesian mining complex. There, the surface operators would stop a few times a day so that they could go to local areas of worship to pray. And the mine was planning to transition from surface to underground operations. And as you can imagine, these breaks throughout the day would only be complicated by additional time that would be needed to move the workers from the underground to the surface. So taking several breaks for prayer was really no longer feasible if they were having to move people around so much. And the owners decided that they needed to address the workers' needs and come up with a solution. So Stantec's underground engineering project team designed some mosques with adjacent washing facilities, as well as chapels in order to be equitable throughout the underground workings of the mine. And having these facilities on multiple levels allowed the workers to fulfill their religious requirements while keeping the operations moving efficiently. So this reduced unplanned downtime, and it also reduced any additional energy that would have been needed to move the workers from the underground to the service facilities. So ultimately, these underground facilities made for a more inclusive and welcoming work environment, and also prioritized cultural understanding toward the local workforce, while also improving operational efficiency. So there was a benefit for everybody in this situation. So in conclusion, prioritizing social considerations has really become key to maintaining the social license to operate. And with the help of the existing standards that we have and some unique examples, there are many, many examples out there. Mines can take some innovative steps to really achieve these sustainable development goals and also meet their sustainability pledges. But as these examples shows, we really need to be designing with sustainability in mind. Before I move on to questions, as I mentioned, Betty had asked me to add some detail on governance. So governance, whether it be corporate or governmental, focuses on the policies and practices that are used to guide decision-making. So some important themes that you'll see in governance are risk management, codes of business conduct, business culture and ethics, and supply chain management. And actually, gender diversity and equity has also become a high-profile governance issue as well. And then governance also includes a much broader set of activities such as tax strategy, cybersecurity, data privacy and protection, bribery and corruption. And I'm sure that there are others that I'm missing, but it's a whole other area of its own. So with that, I will open it up to any questions.
Okay, thanks, Lauren. We don't have any questions right now, but one of the things that I would ask is about what happens after closure. Some mines may go on for 100 years, but many mines now are like 10, 20, or 30 years. So do you have any experience or information about what happens after the mine closes?
So after
locally, for the local people.
Yeah. So after mine closure happens and you've completed your final design, maybe there's some monitoring and maintenance that has to go on long-term or water treatment. But really at that point, for the most part, the social aspect of ESG should have been addressed. So maybe you would have several meetings or be addressing questions from the community as they come up. But if you've included them in the process through closure, most of their concerns should already be addressed. And granted, there will be new people coming into the area. Demographics might change, situations might change. So there may be things that need to be addressed in the future, but for the most part, as I said, the social considerations should be largely addressed at that point.
Yeah, I would
Does
think
that make sense?
Yeah, when the mine is hiring local people and training them and how to handle the mining process, what happens to those people, or is this something that's planned ahead of time?
Yeah, so that's a little bit more complicated because those jobs go away, right? But a lot of these projects are very, very long term, obviously, as we all know. So yeah, I don't have a great answer for that one because after closure, yeah, those jobs go away, but you've given them already new skills that they can go then and apply to a different job, maybe in the area, or maybe they move to a different area that has a mine where they can apply what they've learned.
Yeah, thanks. I was on a uranium project in Niger once, and the company had built a hospital that was for the people at the mine, but also it was accessible for the local people. So that mine has now closed, but the hospital is still there. So I'm expecting that, that somehow that would continue.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great example. Yeah.
Okay. We do have a question from Francisco Sotillo. How do you maintain continuity on the representatives of stakeholders for the length of the project? Some communities elect their leaders for a short period of time and with different ideas. Also, how to determine their representation.
Yeah, so this is probably one of the more challenging aspects of the social considerations. It takes a lot of work, honestly, to keep up with changing thoughts and changing leadership, right? So it really comes down to exactly what I was saying, just continuing to include these people, include the stakeholders throughout the process. So even if the people are changing, you can get feedback from them throughout the process and say, okay, well, this is what we're doing now because of X, Y, and Z. And it really comes down, as I said, to communication and transparency. So if your opinion changes on something, ask them why, try to get some understanding, and say, maybe there's an area where you can come to a compromise. Say, well, this is the way we're going because, as I said, X, Y, or Z. And yeah, see if there's some area of common ground. But yeah, I agree. It's a very challenging thing to address.
Peter Dolph asks, have mines considered trust funds to maintain water management, equipment costs, and professional staffing needs after mine life?
That is a question I do not know the answer to, and maybe Patrick will have an insight on that. I'm not totally sure. Sorry, I can't be of much help there.
Yeah, I don't know about the funds, but in my presentation, I will comment that water treatment in perpetuity is no longer considered a viable closure option for a lot of mines that are in planning. It's just, you can't maintain it. Perpetuity is a long time.
Okay, I think we're finished with Lauren. Thank you so very much. And,
yeah, of course.
We do have another question. While Patrick is getting his screen shared, from Alex Edstrom. You've shown a few carrot examples of ESG. Do you have any examples where ESG wasn't implemented and it negatively affected an operation? Oh, there's probably plenty of those.
Yes.
Oh my gosh, Tia Maria, there's so many examples of, I'm sorry, go ahead, Lauren.
No, that's okay, Patrick. Alex, great question. Yes, there are a lot of examples. The one personally that I have worked on, I can't think of one, but there are many, many, many out there. I mean, we heard about the project in Australia earlier this year, where some indigenous cultural resources were destroyed. There was a lot of backlash on that. Yeah, the list is very long, so I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, there was the case of a project in Peru that they didn't go in and do little social license working, and the community rose up against the perceptions about water usage and losing water resources, and that, I don't know if it killed the project, but it sure delayed it, and that happens all the time, I'll talk about this as well.
We
Betty,
do have another question. Yeah, we can see your screen, Patrick.
Thank you.
There is another question from Nina Estelero. Have you seen a comprehensive strategy amongst several mining companies to increase D&I as opposed to singular strategies per community or sites?
Not that I am aware of. I'm not sure.
Alistair Kent says Bougainville, Esquel, Tambo Grande. So those are examples, I assume.
Okay.
All right, go ahead, Patrick.
Sorry, I wasn't saying anything.
Okay, Patrick, go ahead.
Oh, okay, sorry. I have been asked to talk today about ESG, and I'm going to focus on the environmental management aspect of this. And so, again, please ask your questions. I'll be more than happy to answer them. Just a little background. I am Patrick Williamson. I'm a professional geologist and a QP with 34 years of experience in consulting. I specialize in PFS, FS, operating mine projects focused principally on waste rock geochemistry, but I also work in water resources and hydrogeology and the design of integrated environmental management programs. I don't have pictures of my cat or my wife or my son. I do have a picture from last week when I was in northwestern Colombia looking at a site. And then I've done a lot of work in Latin America. I was the operations manager for Schlumberger Water Services, which is the picture of the right, when we were managing the dewatering project at Peñasquito. And I was also the manager of the environmental office for SRK in Mexico. And I've worked in Colombia, Ecuador, Chile, Peru, Nicaragua, and extensively throughout Mexico. So my take on environmental issues is very much skewed towards working in that part of the world. So this is a figure we've already seen, but it really applies. Mining is inherently a risky business. CEOs and boards have to manage a wide range of constantly evolving risks to their businesses and investments to create value to their shareholders, replace reserves, and implement new technologies to maintain a competitive edge. Risks vary by the type of operation, the location, and risks pervade mining operations from the boardroom all the way down to the operations. And so social risk, this is number one, license to operate, which includes social risk, but a big part of license to operate is associated with environmental management. And the key aspect of that is water. So license to operate has been on this rating system that the industry sees all over the place, has been number 5 in 15 to 16, number 7 in 2017 to 18, has been number 1 since 2019 on this annual survey. So the types of risks that mining companies have to work at are operational, financial, reputational, social license, and environmental. And all of these risks are ultimately tied to environmental aspects of the planning and operation of the mine. I love this quote. It's from Benjamin Cox. It said, "It doesn't care if you're in BC in the rainforest or in the Atacama Desert, water is the number one issue that a lot of miners have to face, both an operational and an environmental issue." So why? What are the environmental risks? Well, potential for soil and water contamination from the operations, water supply. More and more, the communities are very concerned about not just potential contamination of water, but the loss of water resources. So global water resources are under increasing pressure, and the industry is starting to recognize that a holistic approach to mine water management is required to maintain access to water sources, as well as supply the water to process ore, minimize environmental impacts, overcome perceptions by the communities and the regulators and the voters, and to build and maintain social license. Going on with the topic of water, a lot of mining conflicts in Latin America are based on the perception by the local communities that they are going to be the losers in an extraction-based development. They fear, with good reason in some areas, that mining operations will contaminate the land and water, use up scarce water resources, and leave long-term environmental and visual impacts. This doesn't need to be the case. The technology and the approach towards water environmental management has been changing hand in hand with the social perceptions and management issues. Other non-water related issues that have to be considered during an environmental evaluation management are tailing dams failures due to what happened in Mount Pali and in Brazil, noise, air, dust, landscape impacts, and then potential for unplanned spills, acid drainage, or discharges from tailing facilities that not necessarily environmentally damaging, but visually very bad, such as the spill that happened several years ago in western Colorado. And this is based on perceptions. This is what people think mining is all about. These are old mining locations in the United States. We have a history as an industry of long-term environmental impacts, including depletion and complete contamination of water resources. And this goes back, the Rio Tinto is so named in Spain because it's so contaminated with mine runoff from operations that go back 2,000 years to the Romans' activities. And so people are convinced that these historic practices are still common. They don't take into account the enormous improvements in environmental management by the mining industry. Unfortunately, many of these improvements and good practices are overshadowed by a small number of accidental releases or bad operators. And so the historic impacts and recent accidents tend towards hyperbole and poor technical understanding of modern mining practices. So this is the new vocabulary that we're working with. It's really tied up, if it's not water, it's social license. And it's talking about how do we minimize water impacts, both in the extraction and use of the water and in the discharge of water. And these issues are exacerbated by a combination of factors, which is increasingly the industry is mining lower grade ore bodies with higher waste and stripping ratios. Their mines, there are no elephants anymore. We're going for smaller mines, each of which has its own environmental and water management issues, which makes it harder to manage as a company if you've got a bunch of small mines instead of one great big mine. More and more mining is being done in less developed countries that do not have a history of industrial scale mining or strong regulatory oversight. Water stresses, particularly in areas such as northern Mexico, Peru, and Chile, where more and more of the mines are competing for a scarce resource to process their ore. Increased attention by NGOs, investors, and shareholders on water stewardship and investment risk. This is an important point that was driven home to me when I was at a Columbia Gold Symposium in 2017, and Rick Rule of Sprott came up to me after I gave a talk, and he made a very strong point that as investors in mining opportunities, they were paying more and more attention to the social license and environmental aspects of their potential investments because they were some of the hardest factors to quantify. And they had more and more led to delays and cost increases in investment opportunities. And the last factor is regulatory requirements are evolving. More and more the regulations are paying attention to the issue of water stewardship and environmental issues associated with mine operations. So what is the new paradigm? And so this was the mine that I was trying to remember. This is the Tia Maria Peru project, where water issues led to very long delays in the development of that property. Water is a shared asset. We can't just go in and pump the water from the aquifer and dry out the springs that the local community is using and leave them without water. Water is expensive to manage, putting in a lot of wells, putting in water systems. I really liked Lauren's example of reuse of untreated wastewater. That's a strategy that I've implemented in Oaxaca, and I've seen at other things. And I think that investing in water treatment and then using that water for processed water is one of the best uses or recycling of water and social investments that a mine can make if the opportunity is there. It's a growing source of conflict. More and more people are saying, you're not going to contaminate, you're not going to use the water, and therefore we're going to fight the mine. More and more, especially with social media, citizens have tools to take action. Communication is better. They can reach out to NGOs in other countries. They can mobilize. This is a big issue in Colombia. Mining isn't the only activity that affects local water resources. Colombia, despite its wealth of water resources, many communities depend very heavily on surface water. They don't use a lot of groundwater wells, and that surface water is frequently contaminated by untreated water and industry. And so when you take what little potable water, or you threaten what little potable water is away or is available, people get worked up. And it's not always the mine's fault for using some water. There's other participants in that. More and more the investors are really making sure that there's greater disclosure in the PFS, PEA, not PEA so much, but PFS and FS. There's greater focus on Section 20. There's been some works a few years ago where the greatest number of deficiencies in NI 43-101 reports was found in the Section 20s. And so people are paying attention to the fact that those need to be better done to really quantify the risk for investors. Another big risk is the baseline. So many mines, they're tight on cash. They want to do the baseline in 6 months, in a year. That's just not long enough to get a defensible baseline of flows and water chemistry that you're going to need throughout a 20, 30-year mining project to defend yourself against accusations of contamination, especially if in some areas in Latin America, you're moving into an area with decades of artisanal mining that went on, which is contaminated, caused pre-existing contamination. And climate change. How do you predict the design storm for a mine in 30 years with this unknown fact or difficult to quantify factor? So what are the sources of risk? Cultural dissonance is a real interesting factor that in the best laid plans, there are corporate expectations of what a mine environmental staff is going to do. And the dissonance is what happens actually at the mine level, where they're under the people that are collecting samples or are implementing these corporate goals are under other pressures, usually from the planning department, to get things done. And so there's both cultural distance from the distance between corporate and the mine, and there can also be cultural dissonance between just cultures. It's rude to say no or I can't in Latin America. So a lot of the people that are at the mine working for these Canadian companies will say, no problem, I can take care of that. And then they just can't, because they're telling the boss what they want to hear as opposed to what they can do. Short-term goals versus long-term plans. This is a big issue with closure planning in particular. But a lot of times the people who are making the short-term goals don't take into consideration the long-term requirements of environmental management, and they tend to get pushed aside or diminished. Deferred investment and closure. This is, if you have to make a certain number of ounces in a quarter, a lot of times this tends to lead to saying, we'll take care of the closure stuff next year. And that becomes a next year until all of a sudden you get to closure and nothing's been done, or very little has been done. This got so serious at Peñasquito with the operations staff deferring closure activities that Goldcorp started to put somebody on those planning meetings whose only purpose was to continuously raise their hands and say, what about closure? What about closure? And force the issue, because it was just getting deferred. National regulations versus industry best practices. I currently work on the board for the ADTI, and the mining industry has made tremendous strides through the INAP and the ADTI and the MEND in Canada, and Australian government, the Chileans, even the Colombian government has put out a best practices. And these are all coming out within the last decade or so. And they're wonderful guidance documents on really what we as industry practitioners or geochemists think should be done. What is the best way to manage risk from water management and mine waste management? Unfortunately, the industry best practices sometimes don't align with national regulations. In particular, you can meet all of the environmental regulations for waste rock and tailings management in Mexico and still have substantial risk of contamination at closure because the regulations are so poorly written. And if you only do what they require, which a lot of companies do, you're not managing the risk adequately. And so it's very important for people to look at the regulations and then make sure that they're actually going above them if required to meet best practices. Your environmental plan, your environmental management system is only as good as the people that you have on the ground. So staffing, training, and planning. You need to have an overall management plan. You have to have the right equipment. You have to have the right distribution of staff. They have to know what they're doing. They have to receive training. The plans need to be reviewed regularly. This is something that I've seen where, the corporate says, hey, we've got these great corporate ideals and requirements. And again, you go to the mine level and, the people don't have enough people. They keep on getting told to, I need you to be doing something else. At one mine in Mexico, in Zacatecas, I asked, how are you doing with the implementation of your programs? And they said, well, the problem is that we work underneath the health and safety guy. And his priority, 90% of his time is focused on mine health and safety. And the 10 or 5% of his time that he devotes to environmental is he doesn't know what it's about. He doesn't have time. He doesn't think it's important. So it's not getting done. So what are the tools really required for mine environmental risk? Again, baseline studies. It is so critical to get a very robust and defensible baseline of data for all of the media that are going to be affected during the mine operation. Operational plans, and these are, where are you going to sample? What are you going to sample for? What are the QA/QC requirements? What's the instruments? What's the training? You have to have operational plans for water management, operational plans for waste rock management. They need to be reviewed because every mine I've ever worked on evolves over time. Closure plan. I'm probably preaching to the choir here for the people working in the U.S. and Canada, but closure plans in other parts of the world tend to be, I worked on a project in Mexico where 18 months from closure, they started doing the planning. And it was a mad scramble to get the data and figure out what to do with a whole bunch of acid generating rock that had never been tested or characterized or managed throughout the life of the mine. This is something that a lot of people you have to have a project quality assurance plan. You have to know what you want to get and how good the data got to be. So there needs to be an overarching project quality assurance plan, which includes procedures, training, equipment, goals that are the tool to implement these plans. And data management. Data management has been implemented very unevenly in the projects that I've seen, where we've got some projects that are working with Equus and doing some very, very cool work where the data can be exported into a GIS, and you click on a site, there's a figure below of a project that we've worked on, not a mining project, but the type of data management or data project management support, where you can click on a well and you can look at the hydrograph or the concentration over time. These make monitoring the progress of the environmental program so much more efficient, and also make reporting for regulators and reports much, much more efficient. I heard one case where somebody said they had a junior person spending a couple of weeks generating all of the figures and graphs, and then we came in and automated that process, and it turned into a 5-minute exercise of just putting the files in the right place. I've also seen projects where they're still using Excel spreadsheets, they're still using hard copies, and it's just very inefficient. The data is prone to corruption and getting lost, data entry issues, making it very difficult to work with the data. And stakeholder involvement, Lauren talked about this. Really, you can no longer operate a mine in a vacuum. You have to involve the stakeholders, and that might be, talking to them about concerns about water use, water contamination, helping minimize contamination by the community around it into the mine, commingled water at Marlin in Guatemala. Stakeholder involvement included collaborative sampling, where, if there was some doubt by the community about the accuracy of the chemical data, that the community participated. They took splits at the same time in the same locations as the mine staff, so that they could, say, yeah, okay, we're getting the same results, so they must be true. So this is a summary. How do you minimize environmental risks? Good science. Good science and an adequate characterization. Maintaining a constant focus from the PFS on the closure plan, on the design, regular updates, and implementation of measures that will take you to closure. Management plans. Waste rock, you have to have waste rock management. You have to have water management. You have to have, the plans have to be developed, and they have to evolve with the mine. Going back to Lauren's talk, you have to understand the social, cultural, economic, and environmental value of water. We are no longer users of water. We need to be stewards. And stewardship is an important concept. Basically, the concept of stewardship is that instead of using the water and then walking away from the project closure, we need to protect, enhance, and preserve an asset that does not necessarily belong to us as the miners, but has been temporarily entrusted us to use and protect. Baselines, I've already talked about this. You have to have a good baseline. and then the concept of water stewardship versus water use. Okay.
All right, thanks, Patrick. We do have several questions. David Kelly asks, you mentioned a reliance on surface water. Why is there not more focus on groundwater supply for local communities, especially in small Andean communities?
That's a very good question. And the answer to it is that groundwater is not traditional. Groundwater is expensive. It requires specialized equipment to put in, the drill rigs. It requires downhole pumps. Just for example, we need to do some pumping tests in Colombia. And I said, go get an electric downhole submersible pump. They said, we can't. They don't exist in Colombia, not small ones, because there's not a tradition of wells. There are traditions of huge municipal supply wells or irrigation wells using top heads, shaft drives down from the surface. So you either have to do, putting in a well is actually not nearly as easy in Latin America, especially in remote parts, as it is in like North America, where you can just whistle up the local drilling contractor to put in a well for you.
Okay, we have a question from Francisco Sotillo. How to communicate to people about the new technologies for getting water without competing for the actual land sources in a given place? For example, using desalinated seawater for the project, such as in the case of Tia Maria. The message is not going through.
That, and I'm sure Lauren would chime in, that's a matter of communication with the community. And that's very difficult because on so many levels. First of all, a lot of people do not understand what groundwater is. People think of rivers flowing underground. So, for example, when in San Jose de Progreso in Oaxaca, working with the Zapotec communities, at first the idea was to possibly use groundwater resources. And so I went down with a transparent sandbox that is made by a university to show the concepts of groundwater flow and how wells work and flow from one area to another, a maquette. And we had these public meetings with the Zapotec community. And then the second difficulty is, the people that don't want the mine, in some cases, are more than willing to just lie through their teeth about the potential impact of the mine on the local community. In that case, in that particular place, there was a Catholic priest who was saying the mine is going to suck all the water out of it, the rivers are going to go dry, your houses are going to fall down. And none of it was true. And so it was a sort of very uphill battle trying to fight against that bad information. But a lot of it has to do with community outreach and education.
I think you nailed it, Patrick. I don't have anything to that.
Yeah, Francisco also says, this may be tied to the history of the mines. How do you promote the actual information on environmental new technology used?
Again, it's got to be community outreach and education, website education, flyers, meeting with the community. A lot of the people with concerns, again, in Latin America, they really don't have a very good knowledge of modern industrial mining. They're used to seeing sort of artisanal or small scale mining, which is, messy and dirty. And they think that, if that's going to be done on a much larger scale, it's going to have the same effects. And so a lot of it is outreach and education.
All right. Lauren, do you have anything else to add?
Nope, nothing else from me.
Well, let's see. We do have several more questions. Marco Carrasco says, in my opinion, in addition to what has been presented, in order to minimize social and environmental risks, it is necessary to implement protocols and policies from the initial stages of mining projects, field geology, and exploration. The initial stages are the basis for the success of the projects. The communication plan is the key. Trust with communities and stakeholders is gained from the beginning. So this is a comment, and Marco's from
comment,
Peru.
and I'd like to comment on the comment, which is that
Yeah,
this is very true, but unfortunately, a lot of times the people that do the exploration are not the people that move in and do the development. And so, a lot of exploration companies, they just want to find enough resource to put out a PEA and flip the property with the value added to it through the definition of the resource. They don't care about water or acid rock drainage. I can only think of maybe one or two cases where somebody has asked me about water issues or mine waste rock during exploration. That's not their focus. And so you have this change in ownership and approach. And so I completely agree with Marco, but that's just not the way that the mining industry really works, unless you're a really big company and you're exploring around an existing mine operation for additional resource, or a company that is big enough to go and do your own exploration and development. But most of the exploration work is done by people that will not develop the mine. So
Peter Dolph asks, is there any cost data on price per ounce or price per pound for water management for the industry as a whole? This could be used as a baseline for investment.
There isn't. I'm not aware of any price per ounce or per pound, but the cost of water management, of characterization of water management, is going up. I recall a figure somewhere in an article where they stated that people don't understand, or people are coming to the understanding that water and water management is going to cost 10 to 15% of the total investment. A lot of people underestimate how much water is going to cost for a development project.
And Alex Edstrom asks, what do you think is the primary reason for short-sighted lack of investing in environment?
That's the whole thing about how, the entire nature of investment is that projects are predicated and sold on how fast they can pay back their investors and what is going to be the return on that investment. A lot of people who are making the investments in these mines, they're not thinking towards closure. They just want to invest in a new property and get their money out with a healthy profit. They don't care what happens 10, 20 years down the road for closure and water management. And so it's just, I think, a fact of the investment climate for new mines.
Okay, that's all the questions I see. Lauren, do you have anything else to add to summarize?
Nothing else to add. I think we've hit a lot of, there have been a lot of great questions, and we've hit a lot of great points between all of this. So it's a great introduction to ESG, I think.
Great. Patrick, do you have any final words?
No, I don't.
Well, we very, very much appreciate your participation, Patrick and Lauren, and thank you for all of the people that showed up, and we appreciate all of the questions and the input. So I will go ahead and close the webinar. Thank you so much for showing up.
Great, thanks, Betty.
Also, this recording and the questions in the chat will be posted on our website, www.mmsa.net, and that will happen within the next week or so. So we appreciate it. There will be more webinars in this series, so watch for our notices. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thanks, bye.